Upcoming courses, again, Acts of the Apostles, School of Evangelization. That begins on April 18th and will run until May 16th. It's a 7 to 8:30 p.m. class with video recordings. And Charity, Love of God, Love of Neighbor, two separate dates. April 22nd is in person and April 26th is online. And there will be video recording provided of the second lecture. So tonight we close out the canzoniere. In the last lecture, we had the death of Lara marked in poem 267. And tonight we go from 319 to 366 as Petrarch basically winds down his own life and is very conscious of that fact. Last week worked well, I thought or hoped, with the number of sonnets that we went through. It's a section of the canzoniere that's just so heavy in sonnets. And I hope that gave a sense of what Petrarch's poetry is like when you read all of them. We don't have time to go through all of them tonight. And tonight is more heavy on the canzoni, the longer poems that allow deeper exploration of themes. So we'll begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix Salve Porta, ex qua mundo lux est orta. Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, vale o valde decora, et pro nobis Christum exora. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So some of the themes that we should be looking out for tonight, the words that will appear again and again. Number one is veil. We have that down at the bottom here. Women in the Middle Ages typically wore veils just as an ordinary event. The veil has other significances, of course, as it serves to cover up the true form. And so after the death of Laura, the veil here has the one meaning of her corpo, her body, her physical body, is a veil because while she was on Earth, the body served as a veil that you can see just like a veil. You can see the outside, but you're not permitted to see the inner person there. But as her body now is dust, as Petrarch will remind us repeatedly, and her soul is in heaven, the better part, the soul, is the reality that had been covered by the veil before. The changeableness, the instability of the world of the age, and Petrarch's tiredness of it. Death figures, of course, throughout, but death appears as a personification much more frequently than it had before. And there's going to be a set of poems where Petrarch frequently goes into the dream world, whether they're actual dreams or waking dreams. Lara is called up in his imagination, and in one of the canzoni, she actually talks to him. So, I dì miei più legger che nessun cervo, fuggir come ombra e non vider più bene qu'un batter d'occhio, e poche ore serene, camare e dolci nella mente servo. Misero mondo, instabile e protervo, del tutto cieco chi in te pon sue spene. Che in te mi fu il cuor tolto, error sel tene, tal che già terra e non giunge osso a nervo. Ma la forma miglior che vive ancora e vivrà sempre su nell'alto cielo, Di sue bellezze ogni or più mi innamora. E vo sol in pensar, cangiando il pelo, qual è lei oggi in quel parte dimora, qual a vedere il suo leggiadro velo. And the last few lines of this, it, it brings us back to the very introductory poem of the entire collection, where Petrarch is reflecting on, all of the wasted time of his youth that were spent on youthful follies. Now he can see, although only in thought, with the hair having whitened, age taking on, what she is today, in what place she is, and what it was to see her graceful veil. So what she is today and in what place she is, both the soul in heaven, Laura as a saint, literally, Laura experiencing the beatific vision, and what it was to see her graceful veil, and what it was in the past to have seen only her physical body. Um, One who is already earth and looses sinew from bone. Um, that body that is going back, ashes thou art, and to ashes thou shalt return. That's where Laura is now. But the better form, and that lives forever in the high heavens, makes me more in love now with all of her beauties. So that's a theme Petrarch's going to develop and run with throughout the poems that we look at tonight. Uh, she continues to inspire him, but in a much deeper way. And if we had more time, we'd look at this one as well. Sento Laura mia antica. I feel the ancient breeze, but that breeze is it's also I sense my ancient Laura. Ancient not antica. How do we translate that well? Um his Laura from a much earlier time. Orvo piangendo il suo cenere sparso. Now I go weeping for her scattered dust. And two poems, 321 and 322, where he returns to Vaucluse, which it was his poetic writing home outside of Avignon, where he claimed that he could see Laura's house from. Of course, now there is no Laura there to see. 323. This poem is particularly important. It's a vision poem that represents Laura's death in through six different metaphors. Um, if we can remember all the way back to the first lesson, poem 23 was Il dolce tempo della prima tarde, which was the first canzone that appeared in the entire work. And that's what's known as the canzone of the Metamorphoses. And in that poem, Petrarch compared his chasing for Laura to six different metamorphoses described by Ovid in Greco-Roman mythology. Here, 300 poems later, and the numbers are incredibly important. It's not just chance that 300 poems later, he describes another vision of metaphorical death. And if we remember, if we take the theory of the calendar structure to the canzoniere, which in my opinion, it's pretty solid. In the year 1348, when Laura died, that was a leap year. So that year had 366 days. There's 366 poems in this collection. If we begin with poem number one being April 6th, which is the fictional date of him seeing Laura and falling in love, which is also the memorial of Christ's death. In the Middle Ages, April 6th was believed to be the anniversary date of when Christ was crucified. Uh, so with that calendar structure, we begin with the birth of his love for Laura and the death of Christ. By that, poem 263 or poem 264 brings us to Christmas Day, the birth of Christ. 323 would seem to be Laura's birthday, February 22nd, 1308. He doesn't mention her birthday anywhere in his writings. But two poems from here in 325, in a different canzone, he gives a horoscope that describes Laura's birth, and the position of the planets in that correspond to the date of February 22nd, 1308. And if we accept this calendar hypothesis, which I do, having this poem, this loaded poem that meditates on her death, occur on her birthday, it works well with the overall effect of the calendar chiassis that Petrarch is going with. The birth of his love for Laura on the death of Christ, the poem that marks the end of his love for Laura, because in the second part, that's when he wants to move on with Io vo pensando. That marks the birth of Christ. And so here, on Laura's birthday to Earth, Petrarch celebrates her death, which is her birth into eternal life. Standomi un giorno solo alla finestra, onde cose vedea tante, e sì nove, che era sol di mirar, quasi già stanco, una ferma parve da man destra. And that right hand, of course, is always the side of righteousness, the side of Laura, and the wild creature is Laura. Con fronte umana da fa arder Giove, cacciata da duo veltri, un nero, un bianco. The two hunting dogs, the veltri, the hounds, the black and the white are representatives of time in the Middle Ages. Che l'uno e l'altro fianco della fera gentil mordean si forte, che in poco tempo la menaro al passo, ove chiusa in un sasso, vinse molto bellezza acerba morte, e mi fe sospirar sua dura sorte. Indi per alto mar vidi una nave con le sarte di seta ed or la vela, tutta d'avorio e de beno contesta, il mar tranquillo e l'aura era suave, il ciel quale se nulla nube il vela, e la carca di ricca merce onesta. Poi repente tempesta oriental turbò sì l'aere e l'onde, che la nave percosse ad uno scoglio, o grave cordoglio breve ora oppresse, e poco spazio asconde, l'alte ricchezze al null'altre seconde. The image of the merchant ship going down in shipwreck is one the Middle Ages is just absolutely filled with. Italy made all of its wealth off of trade. So the stories of these ships loaded with the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars of merchandise that go down in storms in the sea. Here it's transformed into the real treasure of the world that is Laura. In un boschetto novo, I rami santi, fiorendo un lauro giovinetto e schietto, cundele arbor parea di paradiso, e di sua ombra uscien sì dolci canti di vario gelli, e tant'altro diletto, che dal mondo m'avean tutto diviso. E mirandol io fisso, Cangiossi il cielo intorno e tinto in vista, folgorando il percosse, ed a radice quella pianta felice subito svelse, onde mia vita è trista, che simile ombra mai non si racquista. Chiara fontana in quel medesimo bosco sorgea ad un sasso e acque fresche e dolci. And here we clearly have to think about poem 126, Chiare fresche e dolci acque, where Petrarch's talking about the the clear, fresh, sweet waters of Valqueuse. But it's that beautiful canzone where in Valqueuse, he has Laura, or at least the vision of her. El bel seggio riposto ombroso e fosco, né pastori appressavan né bifolci, ma ninfe e muse quel tenor cantando, ivi massisi, e quando più dolcezza prendea di tal concento e di tal vista, aprir vidi uno specco e portarsene secco la fonte e l'occo, onde ancor doglia sento e sol della memoria mi scomento. And the memory. The role of memory in all of this continues to be important as Petrarch goes back from his unhappy present to at least the memories of seeing her in the past, and the future that he hopes is short. Una strania fenice, ambedue l'ale di porpura vestita, il capo d'oro, vedendo per la selva altera e sol, veder forma celeste e mortale. Prima pensai fin allo svelto a loro giunse, e al fonte che la terra involla, ogni cosa al fin vola. Che mirando le frondi a terra sparse, il tronco rotto e quel vivo umor secco, volse in se stesse il becco, quasi sdegnando un punto di sparse, onde il cor di pietate ed amor marse. And so Laura now is a strange phoenix, as if a phoenix, the mythological bird, and that's the bird that lives for 500 years and then soars up to the sun, um, and soars so high that the sun just destroys it, turns it into ash, and then it's reborn. This strange phoenix comes to the countryside that Petrarch described previously, the uprooted laurel tree that was destroyed by the lightning, the fountain that the earth had swallowed. All things fly towards their end. It turned its beak on itself almost disdainfully, and in a moment vanished. Sdegnando, and that's again that disdaino that is a positive attribute in the Middle Ages, the appropriate kind of recognition of self-worth, basically, is what it is. That looking at what this world actually is, the phoenix would rather die than continue to live in it. And so in this version of the phoenix turns its beak on itself, where ordinarily it's burned up into the sun. And it's Petrarch that has his heart burning with pity and love. Al fin vidio per entre I fiori e l'erba, pensò soirsi la giatra e bella donna, che mai nol penso che io non arde e tremme, umile in sé ma incontra amor superba. E aveva indosso sì candida gonna, sì testa, coro e neve pare insieme, ma le parti supreme erano avvolte d'una nebbia oscura, punta poi nel talon d'un piccio langue, come fior colto langue, lieta si dipartio nonché sicura, hai nulla altro che pianto al mondo dura. Nulla altro che pianto al mondo dura. Nothing but tears last in this world. And so here he's calling upon the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Um, Orpheus, the greatest musician in the world in Greek mythology, marries Eurydice, but on their wedding night, so on the wedding day when she's wearing that white gown, um, gold mixed with snow, she's stung by a snake in the heel, which is how Eurydice dies and then goes in and then is taken down to Hades. Orpheus in the myth goes insane for a while and then vows to try to take her back from the underworld. Canzon, tu puoi ben dire, queste sei visioni al Signor mio han fatto un dolce di morir desio. And it's such an abrupt ending that he specifically chooses the myth that he cuts off halfway. Um, Once we recognize that she's being compared to Eurydice, we expect the next part of the myth where Orpheus attempts to bring her back from the underworld. But that is not something Petrarch can do. But the song says, "These visions have given my lord a sweet desire to die." That unlike Orpheus, who can, while living, descend into the underworld and bring Eurydice back, Petrarch's only chance would be to die himself. A madrigal, these are the sort of rare poems in terms of form. And then 325, a canzone. And this is the one that gives a horoscope that sort of aids in the possible dating of Laura's birthday. And as you're listening to these, if you have recall of previous poems, that's exactly what Petrarch intends. In 323, he's clearly going back on what he did in poem 23. But then he's also citing his own previous poems, Chiare fresche dolci acque, Al fin video perentori fiori ed l'erba. That also calls about Giovane Donna, which was the first of the Sestine, poem 29. So 25, Tace non posso. And the sound of that, Tace non posso, compared to Pace non trovo. And Pace non trovo, Song 134, is one of the most famous of the sonnets. We did that in the second lesson, possibly, no, third lesson. And the sounds here, Pace non trovo and Tace non posso, it's very nearly an anagram. That if we take the T and the R from Tace, switch the P over, we have Pace non, and then trosso trovo. It's clearly intended. Pace non posso e temo non adopere, al contrario effetto la mia lingua al cuore, che vorria fare onore alla sua donna, che dal ciel n'ascolta. And this is another theme that will come up throughout the poems tonight, is that of Laura listening to his poems from heaven. And then importantly, and increasingly as we near the end, Laura's prayers for Petrarch's soul. Come poss'io, se non mi insegni amore, con parole mortali, aguagliar l'opere divine, e quel che copre alta umilitate in se stessa raccolta? Nella bella prigione, onde ora è sciolta, poco era stato ancor l'alma gentile al tempo che di lei prima m'accorse, onde subito corsi, che era dell'anno e di mietate aprile. Literally the April of my year and life. E coglier fiori in quei prati d'intorno, sperando agli occhi suoi piacer s'adorno. Muri eran d'alabastro e il tetto duro, d'avorio uscio e finestre di zaffiro, onde il primo sospiro mi giunse al cor e giugnerà all'estremo. Indi messi d'amor armati usciro di saite e di fuoco, ond'io di loro coronati da loro, and that crowned with the laurel. Um, the other event of April in Petrarch's life is April 8th, 1341, when he's crowned poet laureate in the Campidoglio in Rome. Coronati da loro, pur come or fossi ripensando, tremmo, d'un bel diamante quadro, e mai non scemo. Vi si vedea nel mezzo un seggio altero, ove sola sedea la bella donna. Dinanzi una colonna cristallina, e ivi entro ogni pensiero scritto, e fuor tralucea sì chiaramente, che mi feia lieto, e sosperar sovente. Alle pungenti, ardenti e lucide arme, alle vittoriose insegne verde, contro cui in campo perde Giove, Apollo e Polifemo e Marte, ove il pianto ognor fresco, e si rinverde, giunto i mi vidi, e non possendo aitarmi, preso l'assai menarmi, ond or non so d'uscir la via né l'arte. Ma sì come uom talor che piange e parte vede cosa che gli occhi e il cuore letta, così colei perché io sono in prigione, standosi ad un balcone, che fu sola ai suoi di cosa perfetta. Cominciai a mirar con tal desio che me stesso e il mio mal posi in oblio. Ieri in terra, il cuore in paradiso, dolcemente obliando ogni altra cura, e mia viva figura far sentire un marmo, e in pier di meraviglia. And that a statue, but the marble, un marmo, that word that brings us back to Dante's Rime Petrose, the marmo is both the cold hard heart of the woman that will not respond to his poems, but it's also what the lover who goes unrequited becomes. Quando una donna assai pronta e sicura di tempo antica e giovane dal viso, vedendomi sì fiso all'atto della fronte e delle ciglia, Mecco, mi disse, Mecco ti consiglia, che i son d'altro poder che tu non credi, e so far lieti e tristi in un momento, più leggera che il vento, e reggo e volvo quanto al mondo vedi. Tien pur gli occhi come aquila in quel sole, parte da orecchie a queste mie parole. And this figure that appears now is the goddess Fortune. Swift and confident, of mature years but a youthful face, and that's Fortune. The different faces, Fortune that appears young and lovely on the approach, but aged as she passes, and Fortune, who has the power to create joy or sadness in a moment, more swiftly than the wind, and it's she that rules the world as it turns. And now she's going to pontificates to Petrarch. Il dì che costei nacque eran le stelle che produccon fra voi felici effetti in luoghi alti e letti. L'un ver l'altra con amor converse, Venere il padre con benigni aspetti tenean le parti signorille belle. And although the description there can seem kind of casual, where Venus and Jupiter were on that day, in luoghi alti e eletti, con benigni aspetti tenean le parti signorile, took a lordly and auspicious place. That's in Yeah, signorile is lordly, and it refers to the specific houses astrologically that those planets were in at her birth. E le luci impie e felle, quasi in tutto del ciel eran disperse. Il sol mai sì bel giorno non aperse, l'aria e la terra s'allegrava, e l'acque per lo mar ve in pace per i fiumi. Fra tanti amici lumi, una nube lontana mi dispiacque, la qual temo che in pianto si risolve, se pietà oltramente il ciel non volve. The evil, harmful lights there are Mars and Saturn, and with the description of Venus and Jupiter being in a being placed to produce happy effects between them. That tells us how far apart they are from each other. And the parte signorili tells us, with respect to the Earth, what part of the sky that they're in. Saturn and Mars, le luci impie, are scattered over almost all the sky, the harmful lights. The harmful lights are arrayed likely also in a way that, so knowing where Jupiter and Venus are, an astrologer could tell you exactly in the sky where those two planets are just from that description. And someone actually ran the astronomical software, which is fantastic for dating things, and came up with February 22nd, 1308. Com'ella venne in questo viver basso, che dire il ver non fu degno d'averla, cosa nova vederla, già santissima e dolce ancora acerba, parea chiusa in or fin candida perla, et or carpone, et or contramante passo, legno, acqua, terra o sasso, verde facea, chiara, suave l'erba, con le palme e coi e pie, fresca e superba, e fiorir coi begli occhi le compagne, e acquatar i venti e le tempeste, con voci ancor non preste, di lingua che da latte si scompagne, chiaro mostrando al mondo sordo e cieco, quanto lume del ciel fusse già secco. Poi crescendo in tempo e in virtute, giunse alla terza sua fiorita etate. Leggiadria né beltate tanta nol vide il sol, credo, giammai. Gli occhi pien di letizia ed onestate, il parlar di dolcezza e di salute, tutte lingue son mute a dir di lei quel che tu sol ne sai. Sì chiaro al volto di celesti rai, che vostra vista in lui non può fermarsi, e da quel suo bel carcere terreno, di tal foco ha il cor pieno, altro più dolcemente mai non arse. Ma parmi che sua subita partita tosto ti fia cagion d'amara vita. Detto questo, alla sua volubil rotta si volse, in che la fila il nostro stame, trista e certo indivina di miei danni. And this tale that she tells about the wonder that was Laura in this world isn't said to Petrarch with ill intent, but is the nature of fortune, all of those wonderful gifts that you have in this 1 minute. And then she goes right back to spinning her wheel and they're all taken away. Dopo non molti anni, quella perch'io di morir tal fame, canzon mia, spense morte acerba e rea, che più bel corpo uccider non potea. And I think we'll stop there for a couple minute pause before we move on to the next section. If there are questions, please feel free to put them into chat or the Q&A box, or just turn on your microphone. The great irony about a potential astrological dating for Laura's birthday um, is that one of Petrarch's uh, writings, he wrote so many that are contra, that is, against doctors, against astrologers, against blah, blah, blah. All of the different intellectuals that Petrarch had disdain for, which was pretty much everybody except for himself. One of his pieces was against the astrologers, claiming that they were charlatans, that they couldn't really predict the future, blah, 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 blah. Um, but in one of his letters, we know that Petrarch did have a horoscope drawn up for himself. And given the obsession, fascination with Laura, um, if he was going to have a horoscope drawn up for himself, it seems very likely he would have had one drawn up for her as well. We'll return to 326. Um, and here we're going to cover most of the poems for tonight. I want to spend the last hour of class on just the last six poems because, I'm sorry, the last seven poems, because they're magnificent and they deserve it. Ora hai fatto l'estremo di tuo posso, o crudel morte. Ora il regno d'amore impoverito, or di bellezza il fiore e lume hai spento e chiuso in poca fossa. Ora hai spogliata nostra vita e scossa d'ogni ornamento e del sovran suo onore. Ma la fama e il valor che mai non muore non è in tua forza. Abiti ignude l'ossa. And the two loves that Petrarch has that he accuses himself of in both 264, Io vo pensando, and his work, My Secret, the love of fame and the love of Laura. Um, Here he's combined them, her fame and worth. Um, and of course, it's an intrinsic worth, but her fame is certainly due to Petrarch's poems. Um, that Petrarch has made her immortal, which of course he has. Here we are, 650 years afterwards, still talking about her. But not in a way that would be of any significance to her or Petrarch, given where they are at this time. Che l'altro il cielo è di sua chiaritate, quasi d'un più bel sol s'allegre gloria, e fia al mondo de buon sempre in memoria. Vinca il cor vostro in sua tanta vittoria, angel novo, lassù, di me pietate, come vinse qui il mio vostro beltate. Another word that is important that appears, and we can't stop for every poem, but I'll highlight it. Refrigerio. Um, it's translated here literally as coolness, but refrigerio is a loaded patristic word that's going all the way back to Tertullian, writing at the end of the second, beginning of the third century. The refrigerio, and it literally in Latin, it is quenching thirst. So it was used to mean something that can give comfort to one suffering burning thirst. And the first descriptions of purgatory that we have, and they go back to the very beginning of the church. The word purgatory doesn't, but the belief and the doctrine are very clearly there from the beginning. Before they have the word purgatorium, refrigerio is the word that is used to describe the specific kind of healing grace that's given to those who are tormented. Those who are in purgatorial fires experience the refrigerio of God's grace, the knowledge that the pain that they endure is not eternal, but for their betterment. And then eventually heaven itself is often described as refrigerium, that is the ultimate quenching of all human desire. So when Petrarch's using that word, refrigeria, it literally coolness or quenching thirst, but it's it's divine consolation, basically. And we've highlighted down here that Petrarch is pointing out that through his poetry, Lara's name will become eternal. So 331, as I said, tonight's sort of heavy on canzoni. Soleil della fontana di mia vita, the fountain of my life. It's odd for Petrarch to have, some phrase that he has not pulled out yet. But Soleil della fontana di mia vita, allontanarmi e cercar terre e mari, non mio voler, ma mia stella seguendo, e sempre andai tal amor di emmi aita, in quegli esili quanto e vide amari, di memoria e di speme il cor pascendo. Or lasso, alzo la mano, e l'arme rendo all'empia e violenta mia fortuna, che privo ma di sì dolce speranza. Sol memoria m'avanza, e pasco il gran desir sol di quest'una, onde l'alma vien men frale e digiuna. Come a corrier tra via, se il cibo manca, conven per forza rallentare il corso, scemendo la virtù che il fea agir presto, così mancando alla mia vita stanca quel caro nutrimento, in che di morso die che il mondo fa nudo il mio cuor mesto, il dolce acerbo, e il bel piacer molesto, mi si fa d'ora in ora onde il cammino si breve non fornir spero e pavento. Nebbia o polvere al vento, fugo per più non esser pellegrino, e così vada, se pur mio destino. Mai questa mortal vita a me non piacque, sasse l'amor con cui spesso ne parlo, se non per lei, che fu il suo lume, il mio, poi che in terra morendo al ciel rinacque. Quello spirito ond'io vissi, a seguitarlo, licito fusse, e il mio sommo desio, ma da dolermi ho ben sempre, perché io fui mal accorto a provveder mio stato, ch'amor mostrommi sotto quel bel ciglio per darmi altro consiglio, che tal morì già tristo e sconsolato, cui poco innanzi era il morir beato. And the reflection on death, um, and as Petrarch's getting old and having lost so many of his friends in Black Death, the idea that dying earlier might have been blessedness if the upcoming years bring only sorrow. Negli occhi ove abitar sole il mio cuore, finché mia dura sorte invidia nebbe, che di sì ricco albergo il pose in bando, di sua man propria avea descritto amore, con lettere di pietà, quel che avrebbe tosto di mio sì lungo ir desiando. Bello e dolce morire era allor quando, morend'io, non moria mia vita insemme, anzi vivea di me l'ottima parte. Or mia speranza è sparte a morte, e poca terra il mio ben preme, e vivo, e mai nol penso che i non tremmi. Se stato fussi il mio poco intelletto meco al bisogno, e non altra vaghezza l'avesse disviando altrove volto. And those two loaded words, vaghezza, that wandering desire, then disviando, taking one off the proper path. Nella fronte a Madonna avrei ben letto, al fin sei giunto ad ogni tua dolcezza e al principio del tuo amare molto. Questo intendendo dolcemente sciolto in sua presenza del mortal mio velo. And again, now we have that mortal veil, but his mortal veil, and the veil that is the physical body. E di queste noiose grave carne, potei innanzi le andarne, a veder preparar sua sedia in cielo. Or l'andrò dietro, omai, con altro pello. Canzon suom trovi in suo amor viver queto, di muor mentre sei lieto, che morte al tempo non è duol, ma rifugio, e chi ben può morir, non cerchi indugio. And much as I hate it, we'll skip over a sestina. The sestina is probably my favorite poetic form of the Middle Ages. Um, just for the way it allows the poets to play with form and content. The words that remain the same, the image of progression, but the sounds that always return back. And what Petrarch does here is a double sestina. Dante wrote a canzone that he called a double sestina, but it wasn't really one. What Petrarch does here actually is a double sestina. The 6 rhyme words going through the sestina progression twice. We just don't have time. So here we begin some of the poems about the imagination of Laura. Laura coming to him either before his mind's eye or in an actual dream. Vidi fra mille donne, una già tale, c'amorosa paura il cuor m'assalse, mirandola in immagini non falsi. And that line, mirandola in immagini non falsi. Sorry, I had the wrong translation up with that. That's hence the pause. Vidi fra mille donne una già tale che amorosa paura il cuor m'assalse, mirandola in immagine non falsi. The non falsi immagini. So what he's saying is this is not a daydream. This is not his imagination. He sees an image of her that is not false. Agli spiriti celesti in vista uguale, niente in lei terreno ero mortale, siccome a cui del ciel non d'altro calse, l'alma che arse per lei si spesso ralse, vaga dir secco, aperse ambedue l'alle, ma troppo era alto al mio peso terrestre, in poco poi ne uscì in tutto di vista, di che pensando ancor m'agghiaccio e torpo. O belle alte lucide finestre, onde colei che molta gente attrista trovò la via d'entrare in sì bel corpo. De qual pietà, qual angel fu sì presto a portar sopra il cielo il mio corolio, ch'ancor sento tornar pur come soglio Madonna in quel suo atto dolce e onesto, racquitar il cuor misero e mesto, piena sì d'umiltà, vota d'orgoglio, insomma tal che a morte i mi ritoglio, e vivo, il vivo più non me molesto. Beata sei che può beare altrui con la sua vista, over con le parole, intellette da noi soli ambedue. Fedel mio caro, assai di te mi dolle, ma pur per nostro ben dura ti fui. Dice, e cos'altre da restare il sole. And we have her who's blessed now, who can make others blessed with the sight of her, but more so with words, with prayer. Um, And she brings these words to Petrarch: I grieve with you, and the harshness on earth was for our good. That, she said, and other things to halt the sun. Uh, so Petrarch summons up the biblical miraculous to describe what things Laura has to say to him that are not recorded. Del cibo onde il Signor mio sempre abbonda, lagrime ed olio il cuore lasso nutrisco, e spesso tremo e spesso impallidisco, pensando alla sua piaga aspra profonda. Ma chi né prima simil né seconda ebbe al suo tempo, al letto in cui la guisco, vien tal qu'appena rimerar la disco, e pietosa s'asside in sulla sponda, con quella man che tosto disiai m'asciuga gli occhi, e col cuor dir, e col suo ardir ma porta dolcezza che uom mortal non sentì mai. Che val, dice, a saver chi si sconforta, non pianger più, non mai tu pianto assai, quor fostu vivo come io non son morta. And this one is just so unusual and delightful that in a dream or a waking vision, whatever it is, Laura comes and comforts him in bed. That as he's lying in bed, pale and sick, she sits on the edge of his bed and with her hand wipes away his tears. And this image, so much more motherly than that of love poetry, consoles him. What is the point in knowledge that brings distress? What good is all of this studying if it makes you awful? And here we have to think of Ecclesiastes. In much wisdom, there is much sorrow. And this line here, which it just has to be a refutation of Dante. When Dante meets Beatrice in Purgatorio 28, after 60 cantos, we've been waiting for this grand reunion of this woman that Dante loved so much, and himself. And instead, she turns on him because he's crying because Virgil has left him. And Beatrice screams at him, non piangere anco. Don't cry yet, because you have to, there's another sword that it's fitting you should cry for. That Dante, before Beatrice talks to him, Dante has to confess his sins first. Laura here to Petrarch actually does comfort him, sitting on the side of the bed, again, wiping away his tears with her hand. No more weeping. Have you not wept enough? Quod fostu vivo, that you might be living. Come io non son morta, as I am not dead. Ripensando a quel c'oggi il cielo onoro, suave sguardo al chinar l'aurea testa, al volto a quell'angelica modesta voce che m'addolciva e or m'accora. Gran meraviglio come io viva ancora, ne vivrei già, se chi tra bella e onesta qual più lasciò in dubbio, non si presto fusse al mio scampo, la verso l'aurora. And the word plays on aurora here. The gold aurea, laurea, and l'aurora, the wordplay that he had on that with Laura ora last time. O che dolci accoglienze caste pie, o come intentamente ascolta e nota la lunga storia delle penne mie. Poiché il dichiaro par che le percotta, tornasi al ciel, che sa tutte le vie, umira gli occhi, e l'una e l'altra gotta. And here another visitation by Laura, who greets him con dolci accoglienze, sweet greetings, and listens intentamente. That she devotes entirely to him. She listens and take notes of the long history of all of his pains. And we just have to think about all of the poems, the self-indulgent poems of his suffering. And here's Petrarch's real fantasy at the end, that Laura shows up and willingly, closely listens to everything he has to say. And then when clear daylight strikes, she returns to heaven. And this is common in medieval stories that involve either ghostly apparitions, basically, that at the dawn they have to return. And this time it's Laura that returns, with her eyes and cheeks wet with tears for Petrarch's sufferings. Spinse amore e dolore ovir non debe la mia lingua aviata a lamentarsi, a dir di lei per ch'io cantai e arsi, quel che, se fusse ver, torto sarebbe. Che se il mio stato rio, che tard avrebbe quella beata, il cor racconsolarsi, vedendo tanto lei domesticarsi con colui, che vivendo in cor sempre ebbe. E ben m'acquetto, e me stesso consolo, ne vorrei rivederle in questo inferno, anzi voglio morire e viver solo. Che più bella che mai con l'occhio interno, con gli angeli la veggio alzata e volo, a piè del suo e mio Signore eterno. And as we approach the end here, there's a slow development in his thoughts. That as she appears to him in his imagination, he's able now to comfort himself, to console himself, happy that he does not see her on this infernal earth. Rather, he wishes to live alone, that is, that he can suffer living on this earth while Laura's in heaven, or that he can die and abandon the earth entirely. In the mind's eye, he sees her now più bella che mai, more beautiful than ever, flying with the angels to the feet del suo e mio Signore eterno. And now Petrarch has combined his own devotion with Laura's. Previously, we hadn't really seen that, but now things are slowly coming together. 346, similar again to what we've had before. And the final line, Petrarch hears her praying for him, the prayers of the blessed for him. Again, he calls out to her, Dunque per amendar la lunga guerra, to make amends for the long war. That is, Petrarch's constant loving her and her ignoring him. Prega, pray that I may soon to come to dwell with you. He's, since in this world Laura is a saint, of course, Petrarch is perfectly right in asking for her intercessions. And in the following poem, he's hoping that she may win him grace with those prayers. And the last line in this one, Chi vegge il mio Signore e la mia donna. That he longs for that day in which he'll see his Lord and his lady. And the Lord and Lady, the wordplay there, Signore e la donna. Um, Signore is used both of the Lord, that is God, but it's also the literal term for an earthly Lord. The Lord of the manor, the Lord of the city is the Signore. So the Signore and the Donna, the Lord and the Lady. Here, it's just a different lady. But at the end, Petrarch will substitute the appropriate Donna dal Cielo. O tempo, o ciel volubile. Fickle. Voluble is the way that he described the wheel of fortune, the spinning wheel. Now that's applied to the heavens. Che fuggendo inganni ciechi miseri mortali, e di veloci più che vento estrali, ora ab esperto vostre frodi intendo. Ma scuso voi, e me stesso riprendo, che natura a volar va per sé l'ali, a me diere occhi, e io pur ne miei mali li tenni, onde vergogna e dolor prendo. Um, and the sorrow and remorse for what he's done increases as we near the end here. I excuse you and blame myself. Nate, you gave me eyes and I held them fixed. Ne mie mali, on what are to me evils. Not because the thing itself is evil, but because of the way Petrarch loved it was evil. E sarebbe ora, ed è passata ormai, di rivotarli in più sicura parte e poner fine agli infiniti guai. Né dal tuo gioco, amor, l'alma si parte, ma dal suo mal, che con che studio tu il sai. Non a caso è virtuti, anzi è bell'arte. Virtue, non a caso è virtuti, anzi è bell'arte. Virtue comes not by chance, but by true art. That is, through utter devotion in practice. Laura mia sacra al mio stanco riposo, spira in si spesso, che prendo ardimento di dirle il mal ch'io sentito e sento, che vivendo ella non sarei statoso. Incomincio da quel guardo amoroso, che fu principio a sì lunga tormento, poi seguo come misero e contento, di dì in dì, d'ora in ora, amor maroso. Ella si tace, e di pietà dipinta, viso mira pur me, parte sospira e di lagrime oneste il viso adorna, onde l'anima mia dal dolor vinta, mentre piangendo allor secco s'adira, sciolto dal sonno, a se stessa ritorna. And here another dream visitation. And in the dream visitation, he tells her everything, those things that he wouldn't have dared to tell her where she's still living. And she's silent and gazes intently. She listens, and she cries the virtuous tears. And Petrarch has a moment of self-awareness here, anger at himself for having indulged in his selfish self-pity. He recognizes this lost moment of causing her pain and wakens from his sleep. Ogni giorno mi par più di 1000 anni che segue la mia fida e cara duce, che mi condusse al mondo e or mi conduce per miglior via a vita senza fani. E non mi possono ritener gli inganni del mondo che io conosco, e tanto luce dentro al mio cuore infin dal ciel traluce, che incominciò a contare il tempo ed I danni. Né minacce temer debbo di morte, che il re sofferse con più grave pena per farmi a seguitar costante e forte. Ed or novellamente in ogni vena intrò di lei che m'era data in sorte, e non turbò la sua fronte serena. So every day seems 1,000 years to me. But Psalm 90 and the second letter of Peter have that line that with God, 1,000 years is as a day. And Petrarch now seems to have progressed enough in life che io incomincio a contare il tempo ed I danni. I begin to count my losses and the days, and no longer fears the threat of death, since the king suffered much greater pain to have me follow along firmly and with courage. And in this poem, Lauda is left serene. She's not troubled by Petrarch's constant self-pity. Non può far morte il dolce viso amaro, ma il dolce viso dolce può far morte. Che bisogna morir ben altre scorte, quella mi scorge ond ogni ben imparo, e quei che del suo sangue non fu avaro, che colpe ruppe le tartaree porte, col suo morir par che mi riconforte. Dunque vien, morte, il tuo venir m'è caro, e non tardar, che egli è ben tempo ormai, e se non fusse e fu il tempo in quel punto che Madonna passò di questa vita, d'allora innanzi un dì non vissi mai, secco fui in via, e secco al fin son giunto, e mia giornato co suoi piedi fornita. And the beautiful, so Petrarchan opposites at the beginning. Death cannot make the sweet face bitter, but the sweet face can make death sweet. What better guide do I need to die? Quella mi scorge ond ogni ben imparo. And here again, it's hard not to think of Dante and Beatrice, the guidance of death, understanding what the true good is, but then returning to Christ on the cross, and he who was not sparing of his blood, who with his foot shattered the gates of hell. And here we have the harrowing of hell, that after his death on the cross, Christ descended into hell for the purpose of taking with him from the limbo of the patriarchs all of the just souls who had died before his crucifixion. His sacrificial death made salvation possible. So as we're approaching the end here, Petrarch's not just turning to Mio Signore, my Lord, but having a meditation on the suffering, the sacrificial death. Che del suo sangue non fu avaro, who, not just sparing, but avaricious, avaro. That he wasn't greedy with his blood. He didn't keep it all to himself, but rather he shed it for the many. And then we have in this this is the last of the Laura visitations, a canzone, and this is the most extended recreated scene that Petrarch has. Quando il soave mio fido conforto, per dar riposo alla mia vita stanca, ponsi dal letto in sulla sponda manca. con quel suo dolce ragionare o corto, tutto di pietà e di paura smorto. Dico, onde vien tu oro, felice alma? Un ramoscel di palma e un di loro trae del suo bel segno. So she's pulling out the laurel, which we know the laurel has been used throughout, but also the palm. Um, and so, we've had the experience of Palm Sunday, the palm of victory. The palm is also in Christian art significant of martyrs. And I mean, victory in general, salvation, yes, but particularly martyrs. Anyway, she pulls out the palm and the laurel. E dice, dal sereno cielo impero e di quelle sante parti, mi mossi e vegno sol per consolarti. So the consolation, consolarti, to give you consolation that Petrarch was asking for before. In atto, in parole, la ringrazio umilmente e poi dimando, or donde sai tu il mio stato? Ed ella, le triste onde del pianto, di che mai tu non sei sazio, co laura di sospir. And here she uses that laura. Per tanto spazio passano al cielo e turban la mia pace. Si forte ti dispiace che di questa miseria sia partita e giunta a miglior vita, che piacer ti devria se tu m'amasti, quanto in sembianti in tuoi dir mostrassi. Petrarch's never-ending sorrow and tears are reaching her in heaven and interrupting her peace. And here we have the reproof that why is Petrarch upset that she has left the suffering on earth to go to the better life? If he loved her, as he said in all of those poems, he should be happy with this. Rispondo, io non piango altro che me stesso, che sono rimaso in tenebre e in martire. Certo sempre del tuo al ciel salire. And for that poem, the torment, the word that he's using for that is martire. Certo sempre del tuo al ciel salire, come di cosa quom vede da presso, come Dio e natura avrebbe messo in un cor gentil, in un cor giovinil, tanta virtute, se l'eterna salute non fusse destinata al tuo benfare, o dell'anime rare, altamente vivesti qui tra noi, e che subito al ciel volasti poi. Ma io che devo altro che pianger sempre, misero sol, che senza te son nulla. Cor fussi io spento al latte e alla culla, per non provar dell'amorose tempre. Ed ella, a che pur piange e ti distempere, quanto era meglio alzar da terra l'ali, e le cose mortali di queste dolci tue fallaci ciance librar con giusta lance. E le cose mortali e queste dolci tue fallaci ciance. And it's just translated as deceptive words. But ciance are, it's a low word, unworthy words. Meaningless words. Speaking garbage is basically what these sweet, false, garbage words of yours. You need to weigh con giusta lancia. You need to weigh everything properly. E seguirmi se ver che tanto m'ami, cogliendo mai qualcun di questi rami. Follow me. If you truly love me so, abandon all of these earthly concerns. Pluck one of these branches today. Io voleva damandar, rispondi io allora, che vogliono importar quelle due frondi? Ed ella, tu medesimo ti rispondi, tu, la cua penna tanto l'una onora, palma e vittoria. E io, giovane ancora, vinsi il mondo e me stessa. Il laudo segno trionfo, onde io son degna, mercé di quel signor che mi die forza. Or tu, saltari ti forza, a lui ti volge, a lui chiedi soccorso, sì che siam secco al fine del tuo corso. So Petrarch, whose pen honors the laurel and earthly fame more than the palm and eternal glory. She earned the palm by conquering herself, vinci il mondo e me stessa. And in that, vinci il mondo e me stessa, we have exactly what Petrarch hasn't done. Um, he hasn't he hasn't conquered the world because he so desperately wants his name to be spoken with love and fame. That's his love of honor and fame, is loving the world too much. E me stessa, that Laura's chastity that was spoken of repeatedly in the last one, in the last lecture. Um, she conquered herself. She does not give in to her baser desire. She's able to focus on heaven, and Petrarch is not able to do that. Um, so that line, vinci il mondo e me stessa, is directly what Petrarch has accused himself of not doing. And then the only advice for this, turn to him, pray to him for help, so that we may be with him at the end of your path. And Petrarch, still not getting it. Son questi capei biondi e l'aureo nodo, dich'io, ch'ancor mi stringe, e quei begli occhi che formi sol. Are those still the lovely eyes, the begli occhi? Non errar con gli sciocchi. Don't wander about with the fools. Ne parlar, dice, o creder al lor modo. Spirito ignudo sono, in ciel mi godo. Quel che tu cerchi è terra, già molti anni, ma per trarti d'affanni m'è dato a parer tale, e ancor quella sarò, più che mai bella, a te più cara, sì selvaggia e pia, salvando insieme tua salute e mia. And she appears to him with a visual appearance that has been granted her to try to draw him away from his woes. And he instead is thinking of just her physical body that has already been earth. Quel che tu cerchi è terra. What you're looking for is earth. That she has already been taken back into the earth. Her body is gone. But it's given to me to seem such as will draw you from your trouble, and still will be so lovelier than ever, dearer to you, as cruel and kind, gaining together your salvation and mine. I piango, e el il volto con le sue man m'asciuga, e poi sospira dolcemente, e s'adira con parole sassi romper pono, e dopo questo si parte ella, il sono. He cries, and again she wipes the tears from his face, dries the tears with her hand, sighs sweetly, and disappears, and Petrarch awakens. And that's the last image that we have of um, the last image that Petrarch calls forth to Barbara. And we'll pause briefly before we have our grand finale, the final 7 poems. And here, just so that we can see what we have, 360, we have a long sonnet that prepares us for this final passage. And then 5 sonnets, and then 366, which is the final. Quell'antico mio dolce empio, signore, fatto citar dinanzi alla reina che la parte divina tien di natura nostra in cima sede. So here we have the final argument between love and Petrarch, summoned before the queen who holds the divine place in our being, seated in the head. So what we have here is the last attempt that Petrarch has at justifying exactly what's going on. And of course, the queen that holds the divine place of our nature is the soul. So basically, it's Petrarch and his desires arguing with love before his soul, and the intellectual soul that has judgment. And judgment is exactly the point of this. Ivi comoro che nel foco fina mi rappresento carco di dolore, di paura e d'orrore. Quasi uom che teme morte ragion chiede, incomincio, Madonna, il manco piede. Giovinetto posio nel costui regno. And the left foot. I said the left foot, and always the wrong one. Nel costui regno. Und altro chire sdegno non ebbi mai, e tanti e sì diversi tormenti vi soffersi, ch'al fin vinta fu quell'infinita mia pazienzia, in odio ebbi la vita. Così il mio tempo infin qui trapassato in fiamma in pene. And flames and pain, of course, you cannot but think of inferno. E quante utili oneste vie sprezzai, quante feste, per servir questo lusinghier crudele. And the lusinghier, the flatterer, is the hated figure of Provençal poetry, the courtier that flatters the Lord, that tells the Lord what he wants to hear and poisons his opinion of others. E qual ingegno a sì parole preste che stringer possa il mio infelice stato e le mie desto ingrato tante e sì gravi e sì giuste querele. O poco melo, molto aloe, con fele, in quanto amaro alla mia vita avezza, con sua falsa dolcezza, la qual m'attrasse all'amorosa schiera. Che sì non m'inganno, era disposto a sollevarmi alto da terra e mi tolse di pace e pose in guerra. Questi m'ha fatto men amare Dio, che io non doveva, e men curar me stesso. Per una donna ho messo ugualmente in non cale ogni pensiero. Di ciò m'è stato consiglier sol esso, sempre aguzzando il giovanil desio all'empia cotte, ond io sperai riposo al suo gioco aspro e fero. Misero, a che quel chiaro ingegno altero, e l'altre doti a me date da cielo, che vo cangiando il pelo, ne cangiar posso l'ostinata voglia. Why give me these incredible intellectual gifts if I can't change this obstinate desire as I've changed age? That is, the hair, of course, is altering as he's told us all along, but he still has that youthful desire. Così in tutto mi spoglia di libertà questo crudel che io accuso, ch'amaro viver m'ha volto in dolce uso. And to turn into dolce uso, and that's vice right there. This in dolce uso. Through the repetition, something becomes habit. Cercar m'ha fatto deserti paese, fiere ladri rapaci, ispidi dume, dure genti e costume, e ogni error che pellegrini intrica, monti, valli, paludi, e mari e fiumi, mille lacciuoli in ogni parte tesi, il verno in strani mesi, con pericol presente e con fatica, né costui, né quell'altra mia nemica, ch'io fuggia, mi lasciavan solo un punto, onde se non son giunto, anzi tempo da morte acerba e dura, Pietà celeste ha cura di mia salute, non questo tiranno, che del mio duol si pasce e del mio danno. Poi che suo fui non ebbi ora tranquilla, né spero aver, e le mie notti il sonno spandiro, e più non ponno per erbe o per incanti a sé ritrarlo. Per inganni e per forza è fatto dono sovra miei spirti, e non sonò poi squilla, ovvia sia, in quel che vil che io non l'udisse. Ei sa, ei sa che il vero parlo, che il legno vecchio mai non rose tarlo, come questi il mio cuore, in che s'annida e di morte lo sfida. Quinci nascono le lagrime e i martiri, le parole e i sospiri, di ch'io mi vo stancando e forse altrui. Giudica tu, che mi conosci, e lui. Il mio avversario con agre rappogne comincia, o donna, intende l'altra parte, che il vero, onde si parte questo ingrato, dirà senza difetto. Questi, in sua prima età, fu dato all'arte, da vender parolette, anzi menzogne, ne par che si vergogne, tolto da quella noi al mio diletto, lamentarsi di me che puro e netto contra il desio che spesso il suo mal volle, lui tenne, onor si doglie, in dolce vita che miseria chiama, salito in qualche fama, solo per me che il suo intelletto alzai, ov alzato per sé non fura mai. E sa che il grande Atride e l'alto Achille e Annibale al terren vostro amaro, e di tutti più chiaro un altro è di virtute e di fortuna, come a ciascun le stelle ordinaro, lasciai cadere in vil amor d'ancile. E a costui di 1000 donne elette, eccellenti, nell'essi una, qual non si vedrà mai sotto la luna, benché Lucrezia ritornasse a Roma, e sì dolce idioma le diedi, un cantar tanto suave, che penser basso o grave non poté mai durar dinanzi a lei. Questi fur con costui gli inganni miei. Questo fu il fel, questi li stegni e lire, e più dolci assai che di null'altra il tutto. Di buon seme mal frutto mieto, e tal merito a chi in ingrato serve. Sì l'aveo sotto l'ali mie condotto, che donne e cavalier piace il suo dire, e sì alto salire il feci, che tra caldi ingegni ferve il suo nome e dei suoi detti conserve si fanno con diletto in alcun loco. Qual saria forse un rocco mormorar di corti, un uom dal volgo. Io l'esalto e divulgo, per quel che l'imparo nella mia scuola e da colei che fu nel mondo sola. E per dir all'estremo il gran servigio, da 1000 atti inonesti lo ritratto, che mai per alcun patto a lui piacer non poteo cosa vile. Giovane schivo e vergognoso in atto e in pensier, poi fatto era uom ligio di lei, alto vestigio l'imprese al cuore e fece il suo simile. Quanta, quanta del pellegrino e di gentile da lei tene, e da me di cui si biasma. Mai notturno fantasma d'errore non fu sì pien come è ver noi. Che in grazia, da poi che ne conobbe, a Dio, alla gente. Di ciò il superbo si lamenta e pente. Ancora questo è quel che tutto avanza, da volar sopra il cielo e aver da tali, per le cose mortali, che son scala al fattor, chi ben la stima, che mirando è ben fiso quante e quali eran virtuti in quella sua speranza. D'un in altra sembianza poté levarsi all'alta cagion prima, ed alla dato alcuna volta in rima. Or m'ha posto in oblio con quella donna, che l'idee per colonna della sua frale vita. A questo un strido lagrimoso alzò e grido: ben mi la die, ma tosto la ritolse. Risponde: io no, ma chi per sé la volse? Al fin ambo converse al giusto seggio, i contramanti e con voci alte e crude, ciascun per sé conchiude. Nobile donna, tua sentenzia attendo. Ella allor, sorridendo, piacemi aver vostre questioni udite, ma più tempo bisogna a tanta lite. And so the evaluation of exactly what Petrarch's love poems have given him, the fame that he desired so greatly, and his love was a woman of insurmountable virtue. But the love of her saved Petrarch from following his own baser instincts, is the argument that love puts forth. And here, as we're approaching the end, we still need more time for such a verdict. Dicemi spesso il mio fidato spelio, l'animo stanco, e la cangiata scorza, e la sciamata mia destrezza e forza. Non ti nasconder più, tu sei pur veglio. Obbedire a natura in tutto è il meglio, che contender con lei il tempo ne sforza. Subito allor come acqua il fuoco ammozza, d'un lungo e grave sonno mi risveglio, e veggio ben che il nostro viver vola, e ch'esser non si può più d'una volta. In mezzo il cor mi sona una parola di lei, che or dal suo bel nido, bel nodo sciolta. Ma nei suoi giorni al mondo fussi sola, a tutte, se io non ero, fama ha tolta. Volo con l'ali dei pensieri al cielo, sì spesse volte che quasi un di loro esser mi par, tan ivi il suo tesoro, lasciando in terra lo squarciato velo. Talor mi treme il cuor d'un dolce gelo, udendo lei, perch'io mi discoloro, dirmi: amico, orta mio, orta tonoro, perché a costumi variate il pello. Menmi al suo signor, allor m'inchino, pregando umilmente che consenta che stia a vedere l'uno e l'altro volto. Rispondi: egli è ben fermo il tuo destino. Per tardar ancor 20 anni o 30, parrà a te troppo, e non fia però molto. Morte ha spento quel che sola abbagliar suolmi, in tenebre son gli occhi interi e saldi, terra è quella, ond'io ebbi e freddi e caldi, spenti son i miei lauri, or querce olmi. Di ch'io veggio il mio ben, e parte duolmi. Non è chi face paventosi e baldi i miei penser, né chi li agghiaccia e scaldi, né chi li empia di spemme e di duol colmi. Fuor dimandi colui che punge e mulce, e già fece di me sì lungo strazio, mi trovo in libertate amare e dolce, e al Signor che adoro e ringrazio, che pur col ciglio il ciel governo folce, torno stanco di viver, non che stazio. And some of these poems are amongst the very last that Petrarch wrote. I mean, as he talks about being old, you know, he's in his mid 60s, possibly, when he's writing some of these. Um, the man in his mid 60s, still consumed with thoughts of the woman who died 20 years earlier, that he fell in love with 40 years earlier. And he goes through this world that is just empty. But the overwhelming sense that we get of Petrarch in these last poems, as he goes through this world alone, it's an empty world that no longer has anything for him. And as God tells him when Lara presents him before God, she leads me al suo Signor. Your fate is already sealed. To delay 20 or 30 years might seem long to you, yet is but a moment. And we remember that the biblical line that Petrarch cited, that to God 1,000 years is as a day. But it seems so much longer to the one anxiously awaiting it. Tenemi amor, anni 21 ardendo, lieto nel fuoco e nel duol pien di spemme, poiché Madonna il mio cor secco insieme saliro al ciel, 10 altri anni piangendo. So this one here we can date at 1358. The anniversary poem of 21 years loving Lara, 10 years after her death. Petrarch in his mid-50s now. Ormai son stanco e mia vita riprendo di tanto error che di virtute il seme ha quasi spento, e le mie parti estreme, alto Dio, a te devotamente rendo, pentito e tristo dei miei si spesi anni, che spendersi doveano in miglior uso, in cercar pace e in fuggir affanni. And all of these lines going immediately back to the opening poem. Voi che ascoltate in rime il suono, where Petrarch talks about all of the wasted years. Pentito e tristo dei miei si spesi anni. Signor, che in questo carcer mai rinchiuso, tramene, salvo dagli eterni danni, che conosco il mio fallo e non lo scuso. And the recognition of wrong, the remorse, the penitence, and the call for divine grace to save him. Io vo piangendo I miei passati tempi. And this is in a sense, the last poem of the sequence, because what we have as the final poem is in many ways just completely different. So here, Io vo piangendo makes us think of the first poem of the second part, Io vo pensando, where he had that long poem where in his mind he has the duel between his love of glory, his love of Laura, and his desire to devote himself completely to the good, where he closes with that line, veggio il miglior, el peggio m'appiglio. I see the good, but I hold on to the worst. Io vo piangendo I miei passati tempi, I quai posi in amar cosa mortale, senza lavarmi al volo, abbiendo io l'ali, per dar forse di me non bassi esempi. So he loved a mortal being without lifting himself up in the flight that he had wings for. So he made the mistake, as Augustine says early in Confessions, of having loved a creature the wrong way. It's not that we are not supposed to love each other. That's the second great commandment. But in loving another as yourself, you love another as a created being. In that way, our wings can fly us up to God. But in loving something mortal without lifting myself up in flight, he's loving that mortal thing. He's turning that mortal thing into a God, loving it as though it was something not doomed to die, is how Augustine phrases it in Confessions. Tu che vedi I miei mali indegni empi, Re del cielo invisibile e mortale, soccorri all'alma disviata e frale, il suo difetto di tua grazia adempi. And Petrarch is penitent for what he's done, but he relies on grace. Sicché, se io vissi in guerra e in tempesta, muore in pace in porto. And that final coming back of the ship pulling into harbor at the end. E se la stanza fu vana, almen sia la partita onesta. A quel poco di viver che m'avanza, e al morir degni esser tua man presta, tu sai ben che in altrui non ho speranza. And that word degni here, I think it's the only time in the canzoniere we see it on its own. We've seen the other forms of it, sdegno and disdegno, disdain, the appropriate bearing towards things that are vile. Here, what he's calling on God to do. Deign in English, we just don't use it at all. The opposite of finding something unworthy. The little life that's left to Petrarch, may God's hand find it worthy to grant rest. Tu sai ben che in altrui non ho speranza. And finally, we have nothing but God's grace to call upon. And the Italian, there's a little, the literal Italian is, that I place no hope in anyone else. Not just that I have no other hope, but that I don't put other hope in altrui, in someone else. So there is no hope that love or fame or poetry or Laura can save him now. He needs actual salvation. He needs the salvation that only God can grant through grace. And so the final poem of this collection is a hymn to the Virgin. For all of the use of donna throughout this and Madonna, and Madonna in Italian is just my lady. Here we have Petrarch at the end. At the end of his year, and the end of his years also stand in for the end of his life, turning to the Virgin in supplication. There's some parts here where I've modified the translation that I suggested to you if you read it on that website or got the ebook of it. His translations throughout have been mostly wonderful, but he did some weird things here that just threw off the sound of it in English that were just completely unnecessary. So on this, I've corrected those. Vergine bella, che di sol vestita, coronata di stelle, al sommo sole piacesti sì, che in te sua luce ascose. Amor mi spinge a dir di te parole, ma non so incominciar senza tu aita, e di colui ch'amando in te si pose. Invoco lei che ben sempre rispose, chi la chiamò con fede. Vergine, sa mercede, miseria estrema dell'umane cose, già mai ti volse, al mio prego t'inchina, soccorri alla mia guerra, ben chi sia terra, e tu del ciel regina. Vergine saggia, e del bel numero una, delle beate vergine prudenti, anzi la prima, e con più chiara lampa, o saldo scudo dell'afflitte genti, contra colpi di morte e di fortuna, sotto il qual si trionfa, non pur scampa. O refrigerio, and here again, that's the refrigerio is that divine consolation. O refrigerio al cieco ardor t'avvampa qui fra i mortali sciocchi. Vergine, quei belli occhi che vide tristi la spietata stampa nei dolci membri del tuo caro figlio. And here we have the begli occhi again, but utterly transformed. The beautiful, lovely eyes of the Virgin, che vide tristi, that in sadness saw the merciless marks on the sweet limbs del tuo caro figlio, of your dear sweet son. And so we have here, the image of Mary at the foot of the cross. And if you're familiar with the hymn that's used, Stabat Mater Dolorosa, it's used as a sequence. Sequences used to be throughout the masses. It's a song that is sung immediately before the gospel. And there are, I think, 4 feasts that still call for the use of a sequence. And one of those that is still used is Stabat Mater Dolorosa of Jacopone da Todi, who was an Italian poet writing like half a generation before Dante. And that poem is that the mother sorrowfully stood at the foot of the cross, and it's a sequence just of Mary's sorrows looking upon the torture and death of her son. And with these lines, it's impossible. Petrarch's absolutely directing us to that image. Vergine, quei begli occhi che vide tristi la spietata stampa nei dolci membri del tuo caro figlio, volgi al mio dubbio stato, che sconsigliato a te ven per consiglio. Vergine pura, d'ogni parte intera, del tuo parto gentil figliuola e madre, che allumi questa vita e l'altra adormi. Per te il tuo figlio e quel del sommo padre, o finestra del ciel lucente altera, venne a salvarne in sugli estremi giorni. E fra tutti i terreni altri soggiorni, sola tu fosti eletta, Vergine benedetta, che il pianto deve in allegrezza torni, fammi che puoi della sua grazia degno, senza fine o beata, già coronata nel superno regno. And coronata, throughout, coronata has referred to the laurel crown of the poet. Here we have the proper use of crowning, the crowning of the saints in heaven. Vergine Santa, d'ogni grazia piena, che per vere altissima umilitate salisti al ciel onde miei preghi ascolti, tu partoristi il fonte di pietate, e di giustizia il sol che rasserena il secol pien d'errore oscuri e folti. 3 dolci e cari nomi hai in te raccolte, madre, figliuola e sposa. Vergine gloriosa, donna del Re che i nostri lacci ha sciolti, e fatto il mondo libero e felice, nelle cui sante piaghe, prego, capaghe il cor, vera beatrice. And truly blessed one, the Italian there is vera, Beatrice. Beatrice, the name of Dante's woman, is Latin Beatrix, one who makes others blessed. So Petrarch can't help but throw in that the Vera Beatrice is not Dante's Beatrice. The Vera Beatrice is the Blessed Virgin. Vergine sola al mondo senza esempio, che il ciel di tue bellezze innamorasti, cui né prima fu simil né seconda, santi pensieri, atti pietosi e casti. Al vero Dio sacrato e vivo tempio fecero in tua verginità feconda. Per te, po la mia vita esser ioconda, sa tuoi preghi, o Maria, Vergine dolce e pia, ove il fallo abbondò, la grazia abbonda. Che le ginocchia della mente inchine, prego che sia mia scorte, e la mia torta via drizzi a buon fine. And again, everything that Petrarch has been doing throughout, he pulls up into this poem in a different setting. Petrarch, the crooked path, the via torta via, the wrong, twisted path that he's been on. And the word plays, the opposites that he's held throughout here. The ultimate example of these opposites, of course, is the Virgin Mother. And in the previous one, he brought those ideas back and forth, back and forth. The Madre, Figliuola, Sposa, Vergine, Gloriosa. Here we have tua virginita fecunda, your fruitful virginity, your virginity that bears, that literally brings forth life. Vergine chiara e stabile in eterno, di questo tempestoso mare stella, d'ogni fedel nocchier fidata guida. And here are all of the images of Petrarch on his ship, trying to come into harbor, lost at sea, tossed about in the storms of love. Here we have the Vergine, chiara e stabile in eterno, fixed in eternity. Di questo tempestoso mare stella. Star of the Sea is one of Mary's frequent titles of the Middle Ages. Ave Maris Stella, Hail Star of the Sea, is one of the medieval songs, one of the medieval Marian hymns that is still sung. So here we have all of that imagery that we've been hearing about brought back sort of to its highest place. Vergine chiara e stabile in eterno, di questo tempestoso mare stella, d'ogni fedel nocchier fidata guida, pon mente in che terribil procella, mi ritrova sol, senza governo. Ero già da vicin l'ultime strida, ma pur in te l'anima mia si fida. Peccatrice io non nego. Vergine, ma ti prego, il tuo nemico del mio mal non rida. Ricorditi che fece il peccar nostro, prender Dio per scamparne, umana carne al tuo verginal chiostro. Vergine, quante lacrime ho già sparte, quante lusinghe e quanti preghi indarno, pur per mia pena e per mio grave danno. Da poi che nacqui in sulla riva d'Arno, cercando or questa ed or quell'altra parte, non è stata mia vita altro ch'affanno. Mortal bellezza, atti e parole, mano, tutto ingombrata l'alma. Vergine sacra e alma, non tardar, che son forse all'ultimo anno. I dei miei, più correnti che saita, fra miserie e peccati, son sen andati, e sol morte n'aspetta. And this delightful rhyme that Petrarch has here with different meanings of alma. Alma can be used to be anima. So the mortal beauty, actions and speech, the delightful earthliness, the ingombrata, way down, hampered the soul. Vergine sacra e alma. This is the alma in the sense of alma mater. Almost ver Vergine Sacre Alma, and this one should have been rewritten as well. Virgin, most most holy and nourishing would be perhaps the proper translation of that. Vergine, tale terra, posto a indoglie lo mio cuor, che vivendo in pianto il tene, e di mille miei mali un non sapea, e per saperlo, pur quel che ne venne fora avvenuto, con altra sua voglia era a me morte, e a lei fa Maria. And he now turns to the Virgin with his explanation of Laura. Tale e terra, e possa indoglie lo mio cuor. The one who put my heart in sadness didn't know any of my thousands of evils, ills, harms. But for her to know them, what was would have had not to be. Per quel che ne venne fora avvenuto. For any other will than hers would have been death to me, ill fame to hers. That Petrarch looks back on this now, and as he's worked out before, her indifference to him in every way was his path. What was is exactly as it had to have been. The suffering that he went through was his particular suffering, and had it been in any other way, it would have been the death to Petrarch and ill fame to her. Or tu donna del ciel, tu nostra dea, se dir lice e convensi. Tu nostra dea. So Petrarch here, by calling her dea, the feminine of God, he's not saying that she is God. He's using the Latin tradition of calling on female divine figures. Um, Anything that has immortal life in classical mythology can be described as a dea. Um, so Petrarch is not equating her to God here, but just putting her above all other creation. But nevertheless, just that word he has to include, se dir lice e convensi. Vergine d'alta sensi, tu vedi il tutto, e quel che non potea far altri, e nulla alla tua gran virtute. Por fine al mio dolore, a te onore e a me fia salute. And the Virgin of noble feelings, d'alti sensi, refined sentiments. It's a unusual phrase that he's used there. She who sees everything and can do what others cannot, is nothing before her great power. Put an end to my suffering. For it's honor to you and salvation to me. Vergine in cui ho tutta mia speranza, che possi e vogli al gran bisogno aitarmi, non mi lasciare in sull'estremo passo, non guardar me, ma chi degno crearmi. Non il mio valor, ma l'alta sua sembianza, che in me ti mova curar d'uom si basso. Medusa e l'error mio m'han fatto un sasso d'umor vano stilante. And it might seem a contradiction that he's putting all of his hope in the Virgin when he said he only has that in God. But of course, his hope is in the Virgin, that she intercedes with him to God. No one watches over me but the one who, and again, degno, degnare as a verb, which is occurring only here. The one who degno crearmi, the one who deigned to create me. Not for my worth, not on account of my worth, but on account of his image that is in me moves you to care for one so low? Medusa and my error turned me to stone. D'amor vano stilante. Um, Tears lost in vain. And Medusa there. Medusa was interpreted in mythology. Medusa is the Gorgon who's so hideous that looking at her turns men into stone. Medusa in the Middle Ages was interpreted in, how would we describe it? That Medusa is mistaken male sexual desire and fear. Um, that fear before the lady turns the man into stone. So Medusa, e l'error mio, my error. Basically, it's by calling her up, he's talking about what unbridled lust did to his youth. Uh, it turned me to stone, dripping d'umor vano stilante, dripping out these tears that did nothing. Vergine, tu di sante lagrime, e pie adempi il mio cor lasso, ch'almen l'ultimo pianto sia devoto, senza terrestro limmo, come fu il primo, non d'insania voto. Let at least the ultimo pianto, this final crying, these last tears, be in devotion, without earthliness, senza terrestro limo, come fu il primo non d'insania voto, just as the first ones. So he's going from cradle to grave here. And as the first tears were not tears wasted on these errors, he prays that the Virgin grant that his last tears be tears of pure devotion and not this going back and forth. It's been his life. Vergine umana e nemica d'orgoglio, del comune principio amor t'induca, miserere d'un cor contrito umile, che se poca mortal terra caduca, amar con sì mirabil fede soglio, che dovrò far di te, cosa gentile? Se dal mio stato assai misero e vile per le tue mani resurgo, Vergine, e sacro e purgo al tuo nome e pensieri, ingegno e stile, la lingua, il cuore, le lagrime e sospiri, scorgimi al miglior guado e prendi in grado i cangiati desiri. Vergine umana, humane, virgin most humane, enemy of pride. Take miserere d'un cor contrito umile. And in this line, Petrarch summoning up Psalm 50. Have mercy on me, Lord, according to your great mercy. In the Latin, it's miserere me. In Italian, it's basically the same. And that psalm ends with a reflection that at this point, God would spurn burnt sacrifices, but he wants a contrite heart. So miserere d'un cor contrito umile. If I once loved poca mortal terra caduca, a little fallen mortal dust with such mirabile fede, a marvelous faith, what must I do for cosa gentile, towards you, this most noble thing? And noble in the most wondrous sense of that word, that which is created noble as opposed to common. He turns to the Virgin here and devotes everything towards her, everything that had been given over to Laura in his own pursuits of pride. Sacro e purgo al tuo nome, e pensieri, e ingegno, e stile, la lingua, il cuore, le lagrime, sospiri, intellect, thoughts, intellect, style, tongue and heart, tears and sighs. Urge me to better ways, and prende in grado, be pleased to accept, I cangiati desire. The altered passions, but cangiati desire. Cangiati is the word that he's been using out to describe his hairs that have changed color, his skin that is old and wrinkled. So we have to go back to all of those poems where he described himself as aging through this adjective, cangiati, and now they're being applied finally to the desideri, the desires. Finally, at the end here, his desires have matured the way his hair has turned white. Il dì s'appressa e non potea ser lunge, si corre il tempo e vola, vergine unica e sola, il cor or coscienza or morte punge. Raccomandomi al tuo figliuol, verace uomo, verace Dio, c'accolgo il mio spirito ultimo in pace. And then finally we end here his reflection that his final day is coming. Everything, si corre il tempo e vola. Time runs and then flies. Vergine unica sola. Il cor or coscienza or morte punge. Now the heart, my conscience, and death sting. I'm sorry, my conscience and death sting my heart. And the final prayer here, the action, the ultimate intercession that we ask from the Virgin. Commend me to your Son, true man and true God, that he might receive my last spirit, my last spirit, il mio spirito, my last breath in peace. That pace that he has not found throughout in this last poem. And again, this last poem, what we've said from the beginning, it's not the story of his love for Laura, it's the portrait of a soul. And at the end, he ultimately falls on his knees as a humble supplicant to the Virgin, mindful of the suffering and passion of her son that she suffered in watching. Mindful of her mercy towards all. He asks that his final days can be spent in true devotion, that everything that he had devoted to Laura, to his own hopes, everything else can be put in finally can be given over to her, and that she can ask from her son that Petrarch be received finally in peace. And with that, we come to our end of the scattered poems, the portrait of the stumbling soul. That might be the better title for the canzoniere, the portrait of the stumbling soul. Thank you all very much for signing up for this course, for having listened throughout these 6 weeks. I hope that especially the last 7 poems tonight are spiritually nourishing for you during this Holy Week, especially as the thoughts of Christ's suffering for us can spur our own reflections over this Triduum. Thank you all again very much, and I will send out the recording of this to all.